Well, since we're out and about today, we're going to swing by this client's house right quick and do a spark plug replacement on their 2005 Nissan 350Z. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so firstly we'll do an underhood inspection. We see the strut bar needs to come out first. All these 4 bolts on each side are the first things to do. Then we can remove the engine cover and move on to the air cleaner box and the air inlet tube. Looks easy enough. First step in the removal of the strut bar is to use a 24mm wrench and loosen the left and right lock nuts. Then we'll release the adjuster screw. Remember, to loosen you pull towards you, to tighten you push towards the back of the car. Next we'll be using a 14mm impact socket to take the bolts off, and it looks like we're missing a bolt on this car. Well, that is definitely no bueno. Moving on. On the driver's side, we do have all 4 bolts, and we can zip those off right now. Using a door panel tool or a flathead screwdriver is what we will use to pop the clips on the wire harness. We will do the same on the passenger side with both harness wire loops. Once free, now we can remove the strut tower brace. Onto the engine cover, using a 10mm we'll remove all 4 bolts and being careful not to drop them. Chasing small bolts in the engine bay is almost as bad as losing that 10mm socket. And now we can lift it out. Here we're going to undo the harness hold down, and then we're going to disconnect the MAP, or the mass airflow sensor, right there. Be careful not to pull on the wires and move it out of the way. Using that 10mm, we will loosen the clamp on the inlet tube, and we will use a flathead screwdriver on the other side because those are usually different sizes and a flathead will always work. Well, most of the time. Next up is the only airbox hold down bolt, which is also a 10mm. We can now separate the air filter box from the air inlet tube. Grabbing it firmly, giving it a little wiggle and pulling it straight up, and there it is. There is only one 10mm holding the air inlet tube in. Once you zip it off, you can just give it a firm pull. Once it's free, you can flip it up and see that there's another hose there. Use some needle nose pliers, pull the clamp, and remove the other hose. Be very careful not to damage the hose when taking it out. So the next step is to loosen the 3 brackets that are holding the wire harness in place. Those are also 10mm bolts. Next, we'll disconnect the throttle motor connector. We will also be disconnecting this harness connector. Be very careful with this one. And finally, we will unplug all 3 coils, and that way we can move the harness and get more access. As you can see, we've loosened the harness, and you can see the brass threads where the screws for the brackets went. It gives you a better view. Once again, we'll be using a 10mm, seems like everything's 10mm, to get the 3 coils off. We're going to reiterate to not drop the bolts. That is very important. The back coil is flipped the other way, so the bolt is a little harder to see, but it's back there. Now, pulling the harness down, we can pull out cylinder 2's coil and inspect it. Nice and dry. Onto cylinder 4's coil, and as we can see, oh man, that bad boy is dripping with oil. This is going to need new valve covers and gaskets since the spark plug tube seals are non-serviceable. Thanks, Nissan. Digging into number 6, we'll pull that one out and take a look. Well, that's pretty dry too. Alright. You will need a 5/8 spark plug socket with an extension. We have a kit with magnetic tips, which is the best way to go. Now we're going to take the spark plugs out and we're going to loosen them by hand. Do not ever use power tools to do this, as you can damage the threads or rip them out on aluminum heads. Let's take a look at cylinder 2's plug, and that oil is from cylinder 4 when we loosened it. And oh yeah, that plug needs to be changed. On to cylinder 4, we already know what's up with this one, so when we pull it out, it's a wrap. Oh yeah, definitely done. On to cylinder 6's plug, we're going to pull that one out, and I'm pretty positive it's going to look like cylinder 2, so we'll just keep moving on. On to inspection and comparison. Obviously the differences are easy to tell between the old and the new. We're just going to check, make sure that they're the same size and the thread pitch is the same. Then we're going to check the gap. These are already pre-gap, but you never know if they've been dropped. So we're going to make sure that they're set to 0.44 inches or 1.1 millimeter. The 350Z does call for a platinum plug, but our client requested iridium, so that's what we're going to put in. Using our snazzy magnetic spark plug socket, we're going to put it in and thread it by hand. Do not use power tools, do not use anything else. Obviously the reason for that is if you put it in and it goes in a little cross-threaded, then you yammer it down with an impact, you probably damage the threads and or the head. And believe us, nobody wants to turn a quick tune-up into a ginormous job. Now we'll grab our handy ratchet and put it on the extension and just tighten them all down right quick. Cylinder 2's done, and cylinder 4 is done, and finally cylinder 6 is done. Alright, good to go. Now at this point we can take the coils, clean them off, and preferably put them back in the cylinders in which they came out of. Don't forget to check the contacts for corrosion, and feel free to use dielectric grease if you wish. So now, after hand starting the 3 coil bolts, you can go ahead and tighten them down with your ratchet. Especially the last one back here in the corner, because it's harder to get to. At this point we're ready to put the harness back into place. First thing we'll do is plug up the 3 coils. The harness is laid out in such a way that all the connectors should be near each other, which makes finding plugs so much easier. After the coils, we can plug in its harness extension connector. Oh, and don't forget the throttle motor connector, that's important. Oh, one more thing, that coolant hose, we removed that to get a clearer angle when we're looking into the valve cover. You may or may not need to take that hose off, but if you do, please remember to plug it back in, because also that would definitely be no bueno. It goes into this hard line right there. Plug it in and clamp it up. It's now time to secure the harness. First will be the bolt by the filler cap. Next will be the bolt between cylinders 2 and 4. Lastly, it'll be this tight bolt back here underneath the throttle body. You'll most likely need that 10mm with an extension to get to it. Lastly, it's tightening up all the bolts, especially that one in the corner, because everything's tight in that corner. See what I mean? When in doubt, try a different angle. Alright, there we go. So now we're headed over to bank 1 on the passenger side, and boy, this side is pretty cluttered. Let's start off by taking this hose off. Just pinch and slide that clamp. Get some leverage, twist and pull, and it should pop right out. Next, we'll remove this breather hose, which is missing the clamp. It's not required, but you should be paying attention to the small details. Just like that missing strut tower brace bolt, it was actually broken off, probably from improper installation, but it's okay, it happens. Now we can remove the 2 brackets right here with the 10mm, we'll just zip those right off. Whoops, when the ratchet is in the right direction, of course. Those divots on the intake are great for holding bolts, by the way. There's a sneaky hidden one back here. It's a little harder to get to, but be very careful not dropping that one. The last one is super mega ultra hidden behind this harness clip. All you have to do is pinch the little tabs and release it. It's a little tricky, just take your time. Once you've exposed the bolt, you can just zip the 4th and final one right off. Now we will need to wiggle the harness and disconnect his black and blue connectors so we have a little more wiggle room. At this point we want to move connectors and everything out of the way so we can access the coil bolts. In order to disconnect cylinder 1's coil, we will need to unbolt it, pull it up, and then we can unplug its connector. Cylinders 3 and 5 are easy to get to, so we'll go ahead and unplug those right now. Now we just zip the bolt out, and we can pop the coil right up and disconnect her. And boop! That's money right there. Maybe not. Wait. Oh, there it is. Got it! And a quick inspection reveals that cylinder 1's coil looks pretty clean and dry. On to cylinder 3's coil. It's a little tighter over here, so we recommend a 1/4 inch 10mm. And it looks like this cylinder's tube seal is definitely leaking. Now we just have to unbolt cylinder 5's coil. Reaching down in there pretty deep, we'll pull out cylinder 5, and that one looks pretty good. That coil's pretty good shape. Grabbing our magnetic spark plug socket, we're going to do this side just like the other. Here we can quickly check all the plugs from bank 1 and check their condition, as that one is saturated with oil. We already know it needs valve covers and gaskets. This is something that's going to need to be addressed as soon as possible. Since we now know the condition of the old plugs on bank 1, and we have previously checked the gap on all 6 new plugs, we will go right on and install them. Here's a pro tip: if the gap is off, it's better to return it. If you try to force an adjustment, these tips are easily broken. Here's another pro tip: when oil saturated plugs are removed, it'll drop that oil into the cylinder. If you do not have access to a compressor or a can of compressed air, it'll smoke a little bit when you first start it, but that's okay, it'll stop after a few minutes. Remember this guy? So here we go. We're gonna push it in first and then plug in the connector before we send it all the way down. Once you hear that click and it's all set in place, then you can shove it all the way down into the hole, just like that. That's perfect. The next 2 are pretty easy. Just move the harness and pop them in. There's number 3, and there goes in cylinder 5. Now it's just a matter of dropping in the bolts and threading them a little bit by hand. Cylinder 5 is a little more tricky, so you might have to be careful and use a little fancy finger action. So here we will quickly tighten up all the coils, and then we'll get ready to set the harness in its place and get the bolts in. Don't forget that hidden harness connector. Once it's plugged in, you'll hear it click, and then now we start threading in the screws and start setting in that blue harness connector with its bracket underneath the harness. This top bracket's pretty easy, it's right there. The one underneath where the blue connector goes is a little harder. You will just need your feeling skills to start to feel the bolt to thread in. Okay, so the last one is even harder, but just use your patience, use those feeling skills, and take your time. Remember, no cross-threaded bolts. So by the numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4 is right there. Now on to tightening up the hoses. Now here's a pro tip: when you're sliding it on, if it's a little hard to push in, put a little oil on the stud right before you slide the hose on, and then don't forget to put the clamp on right away. This hose that we totally removed plugs into that yellow PCV valve right there, and that stands for positive crankcase ventilation, and the other side goes into the intake to get those gases reburned. Now, as I said before, there should be clamps on both sides, but there is no pressure on this hose, so it'll be okay. Now we will return the intake tube back to its home, starting with the hose that installs underneath it. Don't almost forget to put the clamp back on, and just wiggle that bad boy till it seats in its place like it's supposed to. Now slide the tube over the throttle body and make sure the clamp is in the upright position so you can get to the nut to tighten it. Now we'll just start the bolt that holds the intake tube brace, and then we can orientate the clamp on the front. Next we'll drop in the air filter housing. Then we'll take the air inlet tube or the intake tube, whichever you prefer, and slide it into the airbox tube. Once the tube's connected and everything's lined up, we can plug in the mass airflow sensor connector. Push it firmly in till it clicks. Here we can start the bolt that's going to hold the air filter box in place. Then tighten all 3 up with that trusty 10mm socket. Oh man, the socket got stuck. It's kind of like fishing. Lastly, we'll go ahead and screw in this last clamp with a flathead. And that's it. Drop on the engine cover. Thread on all 4 engine cover bolts at this time. Snug these bad boys up with that 10mm again. And finish off the final 2. And to finish up, we went ahead and put the strut tower brace back on and reattached all the wire looms. We will use the center nut on the strut bar to expand and contract it so we can get the holes into their proper alignment. Then just zip on the bolts and there you go. That broken one we'll address with our client later. Now we'll snug up the brace by turning the center nut nice and snug, about 1 3/4 turns. And then we'll tighten up the 2 locking nuts, and that's it. She's all done. Here's all the tools we use for this project. As always, all our contact information are in the links below. Thanks for watching. Hit that like and subscribe and give us a comment and let us know what you think. Till next time, happy wrenching.